Okay, so the thing I keep coming back to, and I have been coming back to it all week, is this. Paul McCartney threw the first public punch, 1971, the Ram album, a song called Too Many People, a few pointed jabs at John and Yoko, delivered with a smile, deniable if you squinted, and John's response was not a few jabs back. It was not tit for tat. It was how do you sleep, full character assassination, your only good song was Yesterday, you're making music for hotel lifts, here is George Harrison playing guitar while I say it. That asymmetry, a few jabs answered with total annihilation, is the whole John and Paul story in miniature. Welcome to the Mike and Mark History Experience. I am Mike Williams, screenwriter, historian, man who spent last Tuesday in a notes meeting watching a very senior studio executive explain to me why my script needed to be, and I'm quoting directly, more relatable. I smiled. I wrote the note down. I said, thank you. I did not deliver the kind of radical honesty John Lennon would have delivered in that room. The tension between what you actually think and what it costs to say, that is the tension between John Lennon and Paul McCartney played out over 20 years, and the greatest catalogue in popular music. That is what today's episode is about.
I am Mark Donnelly. My father left me a voicemail in 2019. He had watched a documentary about the Beatles. He had the details slightly wrong, described the rooftop concert as being on top of Buckingham Palace, said Yoko was, and I am quoting, a very strange woman, but you could see why he liked her. And then, at the end, he said something I was not expecting. He said, those two boys, what a thing to build together, and then to lose it like that. What a waste of a friendship. My father is a retired engineer from County Clare. He is not a man who says things like that. I have listened to that voicemail probably 150 times. He does not know. I still have it. Whenever I think about John and Paul, what they made, what it cost them, what happened after, that is the voice I hear it in.
Liverpool, 1950s, post-war Britain is still recovering. Bombed out buildings, rationing barely ended, grey skies, and a future that is not obviously coming. But Liverpool is a port city. American sailors come through constantly, bringing records, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis. Suddenly, British teenagers have access to music their parents find incomprehensible, which is the exact condition necessary for a cultural revolution.
The usual recipe. Parents hate it, kids love it, the world changes.
Into this world come two boys. John Winston Lennon, born October 9th, 1940. James Paul McCartney, born June 18th, 1942. Both working class, both lose their mothers young. That loss is where the real story starts.
How young?
John's mother, Julia, essentially abandons him at 5 years old. She gives him to her sister, Mimi, because she cannot manage single motherhood. John grows up with his aunt, seeing his mother occasionally enough to know what he is missing, not enough to have it. Then, when he is 17... just as they are beginning to reconnect properly, Julia is hit by a car, killed instantly.
He loses her twice.
Once when she gives him away, once when she dies. That kind of wound does not heal. It just gets built around.
And Paul?
Paul's mother, Mary, is a nurse and midwife. Stable, warm, the centre of the family. When Paul is 14, she develops breast cancer. 1956, treatment options are what they are. She dies within months. Paul later describes the day she died. His father broke down, his brother Michael broke down, and Paul went numb, could not reach it. He said, and this is the line that has stayed with me. He said, what are we going to do without her money? Because the practical question was easier than the real one.
He went somewhere manageable because the grief was too large.
Same wound, completely different scar. John becomes defensive, sarcastic, sharp, develops a wit that functions as a weapon. Get too close and he tears you apart before you can hurt him. Paul becomes a people pleaser, charming, diplomatic, desperate for people to love what he makes, channels everything into creating beautiful things. Put either of them alone in a room and they are very good. Put them together.
Something else happens entirely.
July 6th, 1957. A church garden party in Woolton, a suburb of Liverpool. John's band, the Quarrymen, named after his school, Quarrybank High, is performing. John is 16. His band is him and school friends playing skiffle music. They are not good, but they are completely committed.
16-year-old boys and unearned confidence, the most reliable combination in human history.
Paul McCartney, 15, shows up with a mutual friend named Ivan Vaughan. He watches John perform and notices immediately John does not know all the words. He is making them up as he goes. Singing Adele Viking song, Come Go With Me, and only knowing about half the lyrics. So he is mumbling and improvising and absolutely committing to the whole thing.
Faking it with total conviction, very on brand.
After the performance, they are introduced. Paul picks up a guitar, shows John how to tune it properly, then plays 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran perfectly, every word, every chord. And John, who is older, who is the leader, watches this kid who is younger than him and arrives at a very specific realization.
This person is better than me.
And then John has to make a decision. Invite Paul in, knowing he might eventually overshadow him, or protect his position as leader and stay where he is.
He chooses smart.
He does. But John later admitted it was one of the most painful decisions he ever made. Smart because together they became something neither could have been alone. Painful because he knew that from the moment he made it. The resentment and the gratitude were there simultaneously from day one.
That is such a specific kind of relationship where you can see immediately that you need this person and it costs you something to admit it.
They start playing together, recruit George Harrison on guitar. George is 14 when he joins. Eventually Pete Best on drums. Later, Ringo Starr. They play clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. Hamburg is 8-hour sets in grimy rooms full of drunk sailors, taking speed to stay awake, living on almost nothing. And that is where they become real.
You cannot fake an 8-hour set.
You cannot. They become extraordinarily tight. And John and Paul are writing constantly a deal in place from the beginning that everything gets credited. Lennon and McCartney, regardless of who actually wrote what.
Which seems fair at the time.
It is fair. Until they get famous and start writing more separately. Paul writes Yesterday entirely by himself. John contributes nothing, but it still says Lennon McCartney. John writes Help entirely alone, and Paul gets equal credit. Both start to feel that the partnership is obscuring what they each actually are. That is a slow problem, but it is burning from the beginning.
Which seems fair at the time.
November 1961, they meet Brian Epstein, manages a record store in Liverpool, sees them at the Cavern Club, becomes immediately and completely convinced they are going to be the biggest band in the world. He is right.
And Brian is gay in 1961 Britain, where that is still illegal.
Living this entirely concealed life, genuinely infatuated with John specifically. And John, who in most respects is a perceptive person, is sometimes cruel about it in ways he later said he was ashamed of.
But Brian protects them and believes in them and manages them anyway.
Because Brian's investment in what they were building was larger than the cruelty, he cleans up their image. Matching suits, no swearing on stage, gets them to EMI. October 62, they release Love Me Do. Their second single, Please Please Me, hits number 1, 1963. She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Both massive. Teenage girls start screaming at concerts so loud the band literally cannot hear themselves play.
Literally.
The amplification of the time is nowhere near adequate for what is happening. John describes it as standing inside a jet engine. They would aim their instruments at the audience and hope. February 64, Ed Sullivan Show, 73 million viewers overnight, largest band on earth. And here is the first real crack, because Paul looks at all of this and sees exactly what he signed up for. And John looks at it and sees a cage.
Paul sees the dream. John sees what the dream costs.
Paul says, we are famous, we are making great music, this is everything we wanted. John says, this is not music anymore, this is a circus. We are performing animals for people who cannot even hear us.
And John is not wrong about the circus. The footage bears him out. The screaming is so loud, you cannot hear the music at all. They are playing to a wall of noise. At some point, that stops being a concert and becomes something else entirely.
It becomes a ritual, and John hates ritual, hates anything that substitutes the form of a thing for the thing itself. He does not want to be worshipped. He wants to be heard. And Beatlemania, whatever else it is not that.
And Paul cannot see that, or will not, because Paul genuinely loves the connection. He loves that 73 million people watch them on Sullivan. He loves that teenage girls know every word. For Paul, being loved at that scale is not a distortion of what the music is for. It is the music working exactly as intended.
which is a completely legitimate position and completely incompatible with John's. And neither of them can fully articulate the incompatibility yet because they are 24 years old and the most famous people on earth, and there is no map for where they are.
So they keep going. Because what else do you do?
And this is the first real glimpse of what their philosophical difference actually is. It is not about music. It is about whether honesty to yourself is worth the cost of what it does to the people who depend on you.
And they are both going to spend the rest of their lives answering that question in opposite directions.
Welcome to part 2, March 1966. John gives an interview. He says, and this is the exact quote, "We are more popular than Jesus now. I do not know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. In Britain, people largely shrug. In America, specifically the Bible Belt, the response is comprehensive. Radio stations ban Beatles music. People burn records in public bonfires. The Ku Klux Klan protest their concerts."
The Klan at a Beatles concert.
The Klan. Paul is furious. Why would you say that? You have just handed them a weapon and pointed it at us. And John
doubles down.
His position is, I am objectively correct. We are more popular than Jesus in terms of cultural reach. And if that is disturbing, the disturbance belongs to the situation, not to the person who named it.
I need to push back on that. Specifically,
I'm listening.
John is framing this as radical honesty. And you work in film, I work in streaming. We have both been in rooms where someone said the true thing at the wrong moment and called it courage. Sometimes it is courage. And sometimes, and this is the part I need you to actually sit with, sometimes it is someone who genuinely cannot stop themselves from saying the most incendiary possible version of the point and has decided that their inability to stop themselves is a virtue. John could have made the same observation about celebrity replacing religion, about what Beatlemania revealed about modern culture, without the Jesus comparison. He chose the nuclear version. That is not always honesty, Mike. Sometimes that is a very specific kind of self-indulgence dressed up as principle.
I hear that, but I want to push back on the distinction you are drawing between the person who chooses the nuclear version and the person who genuinely cannot help it. Because from the inside, Mark, those two things are not separable. John was not sitting in that interview calculating the most destructive possible phrasing. He said what felt true in the moment at full force, the way he always did. The recklessness is not a separate thing. He added on top of the honesty. It is the same impulse. And if you surgically remove it, if you train yourself to always find the more careful version, the deniable version, the version Paul would have given, you do not get John Lennon being honest without the recklessness. You get someone else entirely.
I am not saying be more careful in general. I am saying that particular observation on that particular day, in that particular interview, could have been made without handing the Ku Klux Klan a protest sign. That is not about changing who John is. That is about whether you care what happens to the people in the band with you after you walk out of the room.
And his answer to that question clearly was less than you might hope.
Which is Paul's whole grievance. Not that John was wrong, that John did not care enough about what being right would cost the rest of them. And I think that is a legitimate grievance.
It is. And I think John knew it was legitimate, which is part of why he could not apologise. Because apologising would mean admitting that Paul's way of moving through the world had a validity. John spent his entire career refusing to grant it.
So they're both right, and neither can say so.
Exactly. And the thing about John is the same reflex that makes him incapable of the careful version is also where everything great about him comes from. You cannot surgically remove the recklessness and keep the Plastic Ono Band, the same impulse that produces the Jesus quote producers imagine. You cannot have one without the other.
Which makes it a tragedy rather than just a flaw.
Which makes it a tragedy. We will come back to this. August 29th, 1966. Candlestick Park, San Francisco. The last concert the Beatles ever play. The biggest band in the world walks off a stage and never comes back to one together. And what follows is extraordinary because without the touring machine, they have to figure out who they actually are.
Revolver comes out the same month. Paul writes Eleanor Rigby, string, quartet, loneliness, death, nothing like anything they have done before. John writes Tomorrow Never Knows, based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Backwards guitars, tape loops, sounds like a musical fever dream.
Both extraordinary. Neither one possible without the other one pushing. And that pressure produces their masterpiece. June 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
I want to say something about Sgt. Pepper's that I know you are going to disagree with.
You are going to say Abbey Road is better.
Abbey Road is better songs, better cohesion. Paul's medley on side 2 is a masterpiece, and Come Together on Something and Here Comes the Sun. On the same album,
Abbey Road only exists because Sgt. Pepper's demonstrated that a pop album could be a complete artistic statement. You do not get Abbey Road without Sgt. Pepper's opening the door.
But Sgt. Pepper's is not actually a concept album. The concept disappears after the first 2 songs. It is a collection of extraordinary songs with a fictional band name on the cover. Abbey Road is better, front to back, and you know it.
That is okay. That is a fair point about the concept, but it misses what Sgt. Pepper's actually was in 67. It was not just an album, it was a declaration that the Beatles were no longer a pop band. John and Paul both needed that declaration for different reasons. Paul needed it because he wanted to prove they could make serious art. John needed it because he wanted the world to stop expecting him to be the lovable mop top he had been performing since 63. Sgt. Pepper's gave both of them permission to become whoever they were going to be next. Abbey Road is what they became, but Pepper's is the door.
I will give you the door. But here is what Pepper's actually reveals when you look at it closely. By 67, John and Paul are already pulling in different directions. Pepper's papers over it brilliantly, but the seams are there. Paul wants the grand unified statement, the concept, the orchestration. John wants out of the mop-top cage, but what he actually wants is permission to be stranger and more personal. Tomorrow Never Knows is on Revolver, not Pepper's. The songs John cares most about in that period, Julia, Strawberry Fields, they are not Pepper's songs. Pepper's is Paul's vision of what the Beatles should become. And John goes along because it is brilliant and because he does not yet have a better answer. But the divergence is already happening underneath the surface of the greatest album most people think they ever made.
Which is, okay, that is the better argument all along.
I know. I was working up to it.
You could have led with that.
I wanted to see if you would concede on the songs first.
I did not concede on the songs.
You absolutely did.
We are moving on. The resentment is accumulating quietly, and that is true of John specifically. Years later, he will say Sgt. Pepper's is overrated and Paul took over the band around this point. He is not wrong, but he also let it happen because the result was magnificent. That is its own kind of trap. August 1967. Brian Epstein dies of an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. He is 32 years old.
The glue.
The person who mediated, handled the business, protected them from chaos, resolved the things that could not resolve themselves. Without Brian, they are 4 people in a room with no one to settle anything. Paul tries to step into a leadership role. John and George resent it immediately. They start Apple Corps, this utopian experiment, going to change the music business, help artists, transform everything.
Complete disaster.
Comprehensive. Meanwhile, Paul steers them into Magical Mystery Tour, rent a bus, drive around England with a camera, improvise a film, no script, no structure, pure instinct.
And instinct without structure is not always sufficient.
Critically panned. BBC broadcasts it in black and white, even though it is shot in colour. People hate it. Paul takes it personally because it is his idea. And then in the middle of all of this, John meets Yoko Ono.
And I want to say something about Yoko before Mike frames this, because she has received a genuinely unfair amount of blame for the Beatles breakup.
Go ahead.
She is a legitimate avant-garde artist, part of the Fluxus movement, serious work, not a groupie, not an interloper. She represents for John something he has been reaching toward. Total freedom from commercial expectation, complete indifference to reception. John is exhausted by being a Beatle. Yoko offers him a version of himself that is not that.
But John brings her into the studio.
And that is where it gets complicated. Because the Beatles have an unspoken rule: no wives or girlfriends in the studio. Sacred space. Even Paul does not bring Jane Asher. John not only brings Yoko to every session, he eventually has a bed brought in after she is in a car accident so she can lie beside him while they record.
A bed in the recording studio.
An actual bed. And Paul sees this as John choosing someone over the band, over him, which is the one thing Paul cannot negotiate with: being left. He is still the 14-year-old who could not process his mother walking out of his life. And now his closest friend is doing a version of the same thing.
That is not a music business story.
No. That is a much older story.
May 1968, all four Beatles plus various partners go to India to study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Supposed to stay for months. They leave early when rumours emerge about the Maharishi's conduct with some of the women there. John is furious. He writes Sexy Sadie, the original title, considerably more direct. When they get back to England, they immediately start recording the White Album, and it is brutal.
How brutal.
5 months, John bringing Yoko to every session, Paul controlling every detail. George, who will write Something and Here Comes the Sun, two of the great songs, frustrated that the others still treat him like the kid who joined at 14, and Ringo quits.
Sweet Ringo quits.
For 2 weeks in August, just walks out, says he is done. The others send him flowers and a note, "You are the best drummer in the world, please come back." When he returns, they have covered his drum kit with flowers.
That is both very sweet and genuinely alarming. If you can drive Ringo Starr out of the room, you have a problem that flowers will not fix long term.
Getting a noise complaint from a library, it should not be possible. The White Album itself is brilliant. 30 songs, extraordinary material, but you can hear the fragmentation in it. 3 solo artists making music in the same building. Paul records his songs with one set of musicians. John records with Yoko beside him. George brings in Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps because he knows the others will behave in front of an outsider.
They need a chaperone.
They need multiple chaperones.
I want to say something about George here because I think his position in all of this gets flattened into a footnote and it should not. George Harrison is the person who watches the Lennon-McCartney partnership collapse from 3 feet away for 3 years. He writes something which Frank Sinatra will later call the greatest love song of the last 50 years. He writes, "Here Comes the Sunday." These are not minor contributions. And the other 3 still treat him in the studio like the 14-year-old who showed up at the garden party with John's mate. Paul corrects his guitar parts. John barely registers his songs exist. The only reason While My Guitar Gently Weeps is on the White Album is because George brought Eric Clapton in and the others were too embarrassed to be difficult in front of an outsider. Think about that. He had to smuggle his own song onto his own band's album. And when George finally quits the Let It Be sessions in January 69 and comes back on conditions, one of those conditions is that they stop treating him like a session musician in his own band. He has watched John and Paul's partnership eat everything in the room for a decade. By the end, he is so exhausted by Paul's control that he plays guitar on the song John records to destroy Paul publicly. That is not a man who hates Paul. That is a man who has run out of runway.
What strikes me about George's story is that it is not really about music. It is about what it costs to be inside a creative partnership that does not include you at the center. John and Paul's gravitational pull is so strong that even someone of George's talent could not find his own orbit inside it. He needed the band to end before the world could properly hear him. All Things Must Pass comes out in 1970. A triple album, sprawling, extraordinary, the first Beatles solo record that genuinely surpasses what they made together. And the bitter irony is that it could only exist after the thing that was suffocating him was gone.
Everything the partnership consumed that was not John or Paul.
January 1969. Paul's idea, let's get back to basics. Just us playing live in a room, like Hamburg. We'll film it. They start at Twickenham Film Studios. Cameras everywhere. John is in terrible shape. He and Yoko have been using heroin. They are trying to stop. He sits in the sessions barely participating while Paul tries to keep things moving, which makes Paul look like a taskmaster, which makes John look like he's being managed, which makes everything worse.
And then George walks out.
January 10th, mid-session, says, "See you around the clubs." 5 days, he is gone. The cameras catch all of it. When he comes back, it is on conditions. They stop at Twickenham, move to Apple Studios, and they bring in Billy Preston on keyboards as a buffer. His presence forces them to behave. They are not going to have a complete collapse in front of someone who is not a Beatle.
Same reason George brought Eric Clapton to the White Album sessions.
They need someone in the room who is not them. And somehow, out of all of this, they pull together for one extraordinary afternoon. January 30th, 1969, They set up on the roof of the Apple Corps building in London and just play middle of winter, freezing cold. Get back, don't let me down, while confused office workers stare up from the street. Police arrive for noise complaints, and that is it.
Last time the Beatles ever performed together in public.
They started in a church garden party in Woolton in the summer. They ended on a rooftop in London in January with the police shutting them down. There is something perfectly right about that. And the footage is extraordinary. You can see them smiling, remembering what it felt like. A brief window of joy before everything stops.
And then Abbey Road.
They go back. July 69. No cameras, no documentary, no manufactured premise. Just them and George Martin making one more album properly. George Martin takes control. They agree to a truce. We are probably done. Let us go out making something we are proud of. Paul works on the side 2 medley. George finally gets his moment. Something and Here Comes the Sun on the same album. The others, for once, get out of the way.
12 years of being the third Beatle. And then that...
Right. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make.
I have always thought that line was Paul talking to the audience. Now, I think he was talking to John.
I think you are right. And John quits 6 weeks after the album is done. September 69, tells him he wants a divorce, agrees not to announce it while they renegotiate the EMI contract. So he's secretly gone while the best thing they ever made is still climbing the charts. Paul is the last one who wants to stay, which makes what comes next even harder. Welcome to part 3, April 10th, 1970. Paul releases his first solo album and includes a self-interview in the promotional copies where he announces he has no plans for another Beatles record. The world treats this as the official announcement. The Beatles are over.
And John is furious.
Because he quit months ago and Paul made it look like Paul ended the band. John feels like Paul stole his exit, which is, I want to say this carefully, an incredibly petty thing to be angry about and also completely understandable if you are the one who made the harder decision and got none of the credit for it.
They are both still 12 years old in the ways that matter most.
And almost immediately it gets worse. The business collapses on top of the personal. Apple Corps is hemorrhaging money. John, George and Ringo want Alan Klein to manage it. Klein is a shark, but they are comfortable with sharks. Paul wants Lee Eastman, who is Linda's father, which gives the other 3 every reason to suspect Paul is angling for family control of their shared assets. They cannot agree. Paul eventually sues the other 3 to dissolve the partnership in court. His 3 bandmates. The legal proceedings take years, freeze assets, and guarantee that every personal grievance gets relitigated in public with financial stakes attached. Whatever chance they had of a private reconciliation, that lawsuit essentially ended it for a decade.
The law does something very specific to relationships. It forces you to construct your best case against the person you are fighting, and the act of constructing it makes you believe it more completely. By the time the Beatles litigation was done, all 4 of them had spent years articulating why the others were wrong in the most adversarial possible terms. You do not just walk back from that.
You cannot unsay the depositions. And out of all of this comes the music. Paul releases Too Many People, pointedly about John and Yoko preaching peace while being judgmental. John responds with How Do You Sleep? One of the most vicious things one artist has ever publicly recorded about another. He says Paul's only good song was Yesterday, and since leaving, he's making music for people in hotel lifts. He attacks Linda, and George plays guitar on the track.
George plays guitar on a song attacking Paul.
George is so exhausted by Paul's control during the Let It Be sessions that he picks John's side openly. That tells you how bad things have gotten. But here is what I want to say about How Do You Sleep? And I know you have a different read on this.
I think John knew it was wrong when he wrote it.
I hear that.
I think he wrote it anyway because Paul was the person who mattered most, and losing him was the thing John could not say directly. So he said it sideways. The way he always said the things that hurt too much to approach frontally, through attack, through wit, through the weapon he had been building since he was 17 and his mother died the second time. The cruelty in that song is not the opposite of love. It is what love looks like when you are John Lennon, and grief comes out as aggression because that is the only exit you have.
Yeah. And Paul later says that period was the lowest point of his life.
Because Paul needed to be loved. And John was the person whose love had always mattered most. And John had taken it away in the most public and humiliating way available to him. And Paul is still the 14-year-old who went practical when his mother died. He does not have the vocabulary for this kind of grief either. Neither of them does.
Linda saves him, tells him to stop grieving and start working. He forms Wings, tours small venues, rebuilds deliberately and methodically. Very Paul. Wings eventually has massive hits, Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, silly love songs, but the critical narrative hardens against him. John is the serious artist. Paul is making lightweight pop, and what drives Paul genuinely mad is that he thinks significant portions of John's solo output are pretentious.
Some of it is pretentious.
Some of it genuinely is. Some of John's solo work, Plastic Ono Band, Imagine Jealous Guy, is as good as anything they made together. And some of it is John Lennon in a room with no one willing to tell him it is not working, because Paul was the person who would tell him that. After the breakup, that person is gone.
And nobody replaces him.
Nobody. They are both permanently worse without each other, and they both know it. The critics spend the 70s setting them against each other. Revolution or craft, authenticity or beauty, John or Paul, as if it is a binary. But that framing is false. And I think they both knew it was false, and neither could say so publicly, because saying so would require acknowledging that the breakup cost more than either was willing to admit.
This is the part I keep coming back to. My father's voicemail, what a thing to build together, and then to lose it like that. He was not talking about the music, he was talking about the friendship, and that is the loss that neither of them could do anything about.
By the mid-70s, the anger fades. They are both in New York. John has stepped back from music to raise his son Sean. Paul is still touring with Wings. They run into each other. Stories of them at John's apartment in the Dakota, watching television, playing guitars, just two old friends who know each other more completely than anyone else on earth.
Almost recording together in 74.
Same studio. Paul is recording. John stops by. They play together. Bootleg recordings exist, but neither will do it on the other's terms. Paul wants the formal reunion. John wants it casual and unannounced. They cannot find the middle.
Of course they can't, because that is who they are.
By 1979, there is a genuine thaw. John does an interview with Playboy in September of 1980, speaks about Paul with real warmth. Brothers fight, he says, but the love is still there. And Paul says he visited John at the Dakota in April of 1980. Just showed up unannounced. No agenda, no cameras. Two old men talking about bread baking and raising their kids.
April 1980.
Yeah.
That is only 8 months before.
December 8th, 1980, John and Yoko returned to the Dakota from a recording session. Mark David Chapman, who had asked John for an autograph earlier that day, shoots John 4 times. He is rushed to the hospital. He dies within minutes. He is 40 years old.
I want to just, hold on.
Take a second.
My father's voicemail. I keep thinking about it because my father's whole point, what a thing to build. And then to lose it, he was talking about something that ended badly but still existed. The music is there. The friendship was real. John and Paul had the April conversation. They were almost back. And then there is no more time. There is no last album. There is no version where they figure out the rest of it. Paul finds out the next morning he is in a studio in England. Someone tells him, cameras get in his face immediately. Reporter asks how he feels. And Paul says, it's a drag, isn't it?
People criticize him for that.
I know. But Paul later explains he was in shock, could not reach the actual feeling. The first thing that came out was the practical register, the same place he went when he was 14 and said, what are we going to do without her money? It is the same response to the same unbearable thing. He was still doing it at 40 years old. He never found a different door.
And there is no reconciliation now. There is no last record. There is no version of the story where they work it out.
Paul carries it, talks about John in almost every interview, plays Beatles songs at concerts every time, keeps him present in every way he can.
Because the music keeps them together in the only way left. When you listen to those songs, you cannot separate them. John's rawness and Paul's beauty are fused into something that neither of them could produce alone, and it will exist as long as those recordings do.
Which is a very long time.
Welcome to part 4. I want to start with something that gets said about John and Paul that sounds profound and I think is actually incomplete. The story gets told as a binary, John is the revolutionary, Paul is the craftsman, pick a side. And people nod at that framing as if it explains something, but what it actually does is make both of them smaller.
How so?
Because the John position, say the true thing regardless of cost, tear down the false, and find the real that position only works if someone is providing the structure that makes the truth audible to other people. Raw honesty without form is noise. And the Paul position, craft, melody, the beautiful container that only has power if there is something real inside it. The container without the thing it contains is decoration. They were not opposites. They were each other's necessary condition. John could not be John without Paul making it listenable. Paul could not be Paul without John making it matter.
And they knew that.
They knew it from the Woolton Garden Party onward. It is why the partnership formed in the first place. Two people who could immediately see that together, they were something neither was alone. And it is why the ending was so devastating, not because they failed to get along, because they understood exactly what they were losing and could not stop it anyway.
I want to say what I actually think the John and Paul story is about, not the music industry version of it.
I have been waiting for you to say that since we started this episode.
I think it is about what happens to a great friendship when it becomes too important to survive. The partnership they built was so central to who they each were that it stopped being something they could hold loosely. It became the foundation. And when the foundation started cracking, there was no negotiating the crack because the crack was in the thing that held everything up. It was all or nothing. And so it became nothing. And what follows, the diss tracks, the legal battles, the late night sessions at the Dakota that never turned into a record, the April visit 8 months before John died, all of that is two people who built the most important thing in each other's lives and then could not figure out how to be around each other without it, or without each other at all.
Which is what my father was hearing in that music without knowing any of that explicitly. He just heard what a thing to build together, and then to lose it like that.
He heard it in the songs.
He did. And here is the thing that the Beatles story leaves me with. We live in a cultural moment with enormous appetite for the John position. Say the true thing regardless of cost. Burn it down if it needs burning. Authenticity above all. And that has real value. But what the evidence actually shows is that the John position, sustained alone over time, produces someone who is right and isolated and has no one left willing to tell him when he is wrong. Paul was that person. After the breakup, no one was. And the Paul position alone produces someone making beautiful things that nobody quite believes in completely, because you can hear the absence of the friction that made it matter. The lesson is not be more like John. The lesson is not be more like Paul. The lesson is that the thing which comes out of the space between two people who push each other honestly, that thing is not available anywhere else. You cannot replicate it alone. You cannot manufacture it strategically. Either it exists or it does not. And when it ends, you spend the rest of your life knowing exactly what it was.
Yeah.
You all right?
My father is 81 years old. I have never told him. I still have the voicemail. I have never told him how many times I have listened to it. I am going to call him this week and tell him, because it is the thing that is true, and I have been waiting for the right moment, and there is no right moment. John Lennon would have said it in a song. Paul McCartney would have said it in the most beautiful melody you ever heard. I am just going to say it on the phone, but I am going to say it.
Read Philip Norman's biography of John, the most complete account of who he actually was behind the icon. Read Many Years From Now by Paul McCartney with Barry Miles. Knowing it is Paul's version makes it more valuable, not less, because the gaps in what he can bring himself to say are as revealing as anything he actually says. And then listen to Plastic Ono, Band and Ram back to back. Not for the songs, for what you can hear underneath the songs, the shape of the absence.
Tell one person about this show today, specifically someone who's a creative partnership they are taking for granted. Tell them while there is still time to do something about it. That is us. Ciao.